reason I was moderator of my local church twice is because they wanted to see if I could get it right the second time. My governance background and ideas are also formulated by my experience with governance outside of faith settings. I served as chair of the board of trustees of the Adler Planetarium in Chicago. I served as president of an elected school board in the suburbs of Chicago. So all of this background has informed my thoughts on what good governance entails. I want to say to you, first of all, that I think it's really good that you are interested in the notion of good governance, because one of the things I'm going to talk about are the attributes of a highly performing governing board. How would you know when you're doing it well? What would it look like? And one of those attributes is that highly effective governing board members are board members that periodically take time to improve their skill sets that they need to be good leaders. And so the fact that you're taking time right now to learn more about governance is in fact an attribute of a highly performing and effective ministry leader. I want to be a good steward of your time. I know that it's a long day and there's a lot to do, and I will get you out to lunch on time. And I just assume this be as conversational as possible rather than me just lecturing. So if I say something that you have a reaction to or a question about, just raise your hand and let's deal with it right then and there. If something's on your mind, it's undoubtedly on someone else's mind in the room too, and I think it would be helpful for everyone if we just address it. I don't want there to be any confusion regarding the comments that I make, and so I want to start by talking a little bit about terminology. Different ministry settings use different jargon to describe the people that are entrusted with governance responsibilities. It may be a church council, it may be a consistory, it may be the executive committee. Let's be clear that what we're talking about today is that group of people, whatever they may be labeled or called, that are charged with governing the ministry setting. That's the governing body of the organization, and that's what these comments are addressed to. So what I want to cover with you in the next hour and 15 minutes is first, principles of good governance. What is the foundational principles that good governance should be built upon? Secondly, what are the responsibilities of a governing board collectively? What are all of the people that are on that governing body? What are their principal, their top 10 responsibilities as a group? Then I want to talk about the legal responsibilities that you as an individual member of a governing board have. The law imposes certain requirements on each individual that serves in that capacity, and I want to talk about and make you aware of what those are. And lastly, as I mentioned, I want to talk about some of the attributes of a high-performing governing body. How would you know when you're doing it well? So let's first talk about principles of good governance for a United Church of Christ ministry. And I believe that there are at least 4 principles that are the foundation for good governance in the UCC. The first is, good governance is accountable to the entire ministry and is concerned with the health and well-being of the entire ministry. Good governance is accountable to the entire ministry and it's concerned with the health and well-being of the entire ministry. The second is, good governance exhibits a clear and unified vision and mission. Good governance exhibits a clear and unified vision and mission. The third is, good governance functions with transparency and openness. People need to know what you are doing, and how you are doing it. And lastly, I do believe that there is a difference between governance in a faith community and governance in a secular community. And so my fourth principle of good governance for a United Church of Christ ministry is that good governance arises out of our understanding of what it means to be the body of Christ. Now, these are four foundational principles, and as we talk about responsibilities of the governing group as a whole, as we talk about legal duties that governing board members individually need to meet, hopefully you'll see reflected in those responsibilities and duties these underlying principles of good governance. So let's then turn to the responsibilities of a governing body in the United Church of Christ. If you were to ask me what are the top 10 responsibilities of a governing board, a governing body for a United Church of Christ ministry, what would those top 10 responsibilities be? I would suggest they're as follows. First is to determine the ministry's mission and purpose. It's the governing body's responsibility to create and review a statement of mission that articulates the ministry's goals. Now, there are a couple of details that I want to talk about in terms of developing a mission statement. The first is, I don't want you to overlook the importance of developing a mission statement. I know that when you talk about mission statements, it frequently generates a response of eyes rolling and yawning and disinterest. And I want to suggest that that's not the appropriate response, that a mission statement is critically important to good governance. But I want to talk about the reason that it's so important so that maybe you'll share that understanding with me. But in order to understand my reason for it, I want to make sure we're talking about the same type of mission statement. When I talk to UCC ministry settings, a lot of them will say, we've got a mission statement. And often that mission statement will be along the lines of, it is the mission of this ministry to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ. Now, that's a fine mission statement, and it will always be the mission of a faith ministry in the United Church of Christ, but it's not the kind of mission statement I'm talking about with you today. Because that type of mission statement, that mission that will always be part of the mission of the ministry, is a timeless mission. I'm talking about the importance of the governing board creating a timely mission statement. What is the mission of your ministry for the foreseeable future? The next year or two. Perhaps it's tied to the tenure that you have in office as a governing board member. Maybe you're elected to a 2-year or 3-year term. What is the mission of your ministry during that period of time? Yes, sir.
So what are you saying, that we should make the mission, not the congregation?
You're going to need to follow the practice and policy that's appropriate for your ministry setting, and that's going to differ from congregation to congregation. And it may be that you want to engage the entire congregation in the formulation of that timely mission statement. You're certainly going to want to inform them of what the governing body has decided in that regard.
Because sometimes when I've seen it happen, like, this gets warm and fuzzy, but at the end mostly fuzzy.
And I want to avoid that. When I'm talking about a timely mission, I want to talk about a clear articulation of the missional priorities for this ministry for for the next 1, 2, 3 years. And the reason I think that's important is at least two. Number one, that timely mission statement should be the lens through which you are viewing all of the other governing decisions you have to make. When you all are voting on the draft budget, or you all are deciding whether we should launch this new programmatic initiative, one of the first questions you should be asking yourself is, does this advance the mission of our ministry? Well, of course, in order to answer that question, you need to know what the mission of your ministry is. And if you haven't developed a timely mission statement articulating what that mission, those missional priorities are, then you're hard-pressed to evaluate those other governance decisions as to whether or not they're advancing your mission or not.
It sounds like setting goals.
Yes. And again, I don't want jargon to get in the way. Some people, draw a distinction between a mission statement, a vision statement, goals, commitments. I'm talking about an articulation of priorities for the foreseeable future. However you feel comfortable labeling that in your ministry setting. Another reason why it's important to have done that is when you all are the personification of the governing body of your ministry. And so when people in your congregation or people outside the congregation ask you as a governing board member, what is your ministry and what does it do? You all need to be saying the same thing. If all the governing board members are not saying the same thing, then people are going to be getting mixed messages as to what the missional priorities of that ministry are. And when they get mixed messages, you generate confusion. And that's not going to serve your ministry well. So the governing board members need to be on the same page as to what the missional priorities are, and I think adopting a timely mission statement is a way to do that. You all, in effect, ought to have the same elevator speech. You ought to be able to describe the missional priorities of the ministry that you lead in 3 minutes, 1 paragraph, a short, succinct statement. Way in the back. Yes, I think that's right. And I'm not saying that there's any one way to do this. I will suggest, however, this. I think that it's important for the current governing board to collectively be engaged in that process, because what I've found in my experience, both in faith communities and elsewhere, is it's just difficult to generate board member enthusiasm to carry out someone else's vision. If you're given a strategic plan that the last board adopted and you're charged with carrying it out, it's just my experience that it's harder to generate enthusiasm to carry out somebody else's plan. And so for the current governing body to have set its priorities collectively, I believe gets the governing body more engaged in seeing those priorities fulfilled. So the first of my top 10 responsibilities is to determine the ministry's timely mission and purpose. The second of the top 10 basic responsibilities of a governing board is that they have to reach consensus on the leader, call it chief executive, call it management, whatever you want to call it. For our local churches, it usually ends up being our senior pastor and they have to have an understanding and good working relationship with that management leader of the ministry. Now, in most of our local churches, it's not going to be the governing board that extends the call to the minister. You're probably going to have a search committee, and then you're going to have a congregational vote, and that's how the senior pastor is going to be brought to that ministry. Nevertheless, it's important that the governing board have a good working relationship with management, because we're going to talk about the difference between governance and management. They are two separate and distinct concepts. And where there tends to be problems in a ministry is when those charged with governance start getting involved with things that are really management's responsibility. Now, the relationship between governance and management has to be a close relationship. It needs to be hand in glove. The best way for that to occur is if there is a common understanding of what expectations are. What are the governing body's expectations of pastor? What are pastor's expectations of the governing body? The only way that can occur is if there's conversation and discussion around that. And so the second of the top 10 responsibilities is for the governing body to be attentive to that. It helps if there's a job description for that management leader, that senior pastor, that articulates expectations that the church and the governing body have for her or him. But there also needs to be conversation around what those expectations are. And so that's definitely one of the top 10 responsibilities of the governing body. Sure. Let's talk about the difference between governance and management, since it's come up right now. Governance is the practice of developing policy. You're adopting policies for the ministry. Management is executing the day-to-day responsibilities of pursuing the ministry in accordance with the policies that the governing body has adopted. Sure. Governance is about adopting policies to guide the ministry. Management is about leading the day-to-day implementation of the ministry's programs and works in accordance with the policies that have been adopted. So, for example, a governing body may adopt policies with respect to personnel. Our church personnel get 2 weeks of vacation. That's our policy. Management will be deciding whether or not staff member Don can take the first 2 weeks of January as vacation. That's implementing the policy on a day-to-day practical basis in fulfillment of the ministry of the church. Governance needs to be focused on policy. So what your votes and all should be reflecting is you're adopting policy for the ministry to follow. Budget is in effect adopting a policy. It's setting policy priorities as to how the assets of the church are going to be spent in a given year or budget cycle. But within that, there are management functions to be performed. So, for example, I'll tell you one example of where I see governance tending to bleed over into what should be management decisions. In churches that have more than one employee, it would be appropriate for the governing body to, on a periodic basis, usually annual, usually with the annual budget, to decide we're going to devote X number of dollars in our budget to compensation for our paid staff. And so it might be that the governing body is deciding, all in favor of increasing compensation next year by 3%, say aye. It's management's responsibility then to take that block of dollars and decide which staff get what raise out of that block of dollars. So one staff member may get a 5% raise, and another staff member may get a 1% raise, as long as the total amount of dollars spent are consistent with what the governing body has approved for compensation. But compensation levels is a management responsibility. It's a management tool. Management can't manage well unless they have the tools to encourage good performance and to clearly indicate when performance hasn't been good. So making differential judgments as to compensation is an important management responsibility. Setting the overall amount of church assets that are going to be devoted to compensation is a policy matter for the governing body to decide. In too many of our churches, we'll see the annual budget say, okay, the board is going to decide the organist gets a raise of X number of dollars, the sexton or janitor gets a raise of X number of dollars, and pastor gets a raise of X number of dollars. That's encroaching on a management function.
But in my mind, I'm having a difficult time trying to figure out that if the council, which is our governing board, is to do the budget, who's the management then? Is it our pastor?
Usually it's
in
the...
our church, in our church, I think that we've given the pastor pastoral and ministerial kind of responsibility and not what you call management. So then I'm thinking, okay, then do the board of trustees do the management part? That kind of won't work because they're determining helping to determine the budget. So, I'm just trying to think in my setting, who would be the management then? If it's not the governing board, which is the council, and the board of trustees, which work together.
In most settings that I'm aware of, it ends up being the senior pastor, ends up being the CEO or senior management, if you will. There are some churches in which the senior pastor doesn't want that aspect of management responsibility, and some churches are financially blessed enough then to hire a business manager or whatever title you want to put on that person that carries out some of those functions. What I'm trying to draw a distinction between is the governing board's responsibilities and management's responsibilities. Management can be divided up. It doesn't need to reside in a single person. But what's important is that governance not be confused with management. However you may staff those two functions.
Wouldn't it be difficult to do management by committee?
I think it would be, and ultimately there needs to be a CEO, and so even if you divided up the responsibilities, let's say you have a business manager, that business manager probably needs to report to a CEO, and frankly, I don't know of any church where the senior pastor is not viewed as having that responsibility. Yes, ma'am.
Then how do you determine the compensation which includes the pastor compensation?
That does fall into the governing body's responsibility. That's the one employee that they're in effect going to perform the management responsibilities for. They're going to do the performance review, whereas they're not going to do it for other staff. And therefore they're going to set the compensation of the CEO. That's the one and only time that they're going to engage in that kind of management function. Way in the back.
Okay, I come from a very small church
I would suggest that that's a blending, a mixing of governance with management, and I would discourage it. I'm not gonna say never ever, can't do it. I understand exactly your setting, and a lot of churches do bleed over, but there is risk inherent in doing that. One of the risks is a confusion in the governing board members as to, well, why can't we just manage other things as well? We manage this, we make this compensation decision. And so I think it's really important, as much as possible, to understand the benefits of drawing a distinction and a line between governance and management and living that out to the fullest extent that you can. I want to go on to my next of my top 10, and that is to provide proper financial oversight. The governing body has to assist in developing the annual budget and ensuring that proper financial controls are in place. Now, your local church may have a budget process, many do, where ultimately the entire congregation votes to approve the budget. But as a practical matter, it's the church council, it's that governing body that ends up developing the budget in the first instance, and 9 out of 10 times what comes from that group is what gets adopted. And so it's the board's responsibility in providing financial oversight to do that financial legwork, and importantly, to ensure that proper financial controls are in place. You do this through adopting policy. Policy regarding financial matters. Examples of some financial policies that your governing board might adopt to carry out that responsibility. If your church is fortunate enough, for example, to have an endowment of some kind, or dedicated funds of some kind, it's the governing board's responsibility to decide what's the draw rate going to be on those funds every year. Is it going to be 3%, 5%? Is it going to be of principal only? Is it going to be the total amount that's in there? Is it going to be 5% of a rolling 3-year average of what that fund holds? There are lots of choices to be made as to what policy you're going to adopt, but it's important that a policy be adopted to guide those financial decisions, instead of just deciding year after year how much money do we vote to take out of our endowment. You need to adopt policy with respect to honoring donor intent. If you take funds that are restricted by the donor, you agree to take them, you need to respect those donor restrictions. There's a difference between restrictions placed on funds by a donor and restrictions placed on funds by the governing body. So for example, if I'm a member of your congregation and I come to you and say, I'd like to write the church a check for $5,000 to go toward buying a new church bus. If you say, thank you, Don, we'll take your money, you can only use that $5,000 to buy a new church bus. You can't use it to fix the hole in the church roof. By accepting the money, you've accepted the conditions that come with it. Now, if Don drops a check in the plate that just says $5,000 payable to First Church Anywhere USA, and the board says, let's set aside that $5,000 toward buying a new church bus. That's a board-placed restriction on those funds that came without restrictions, and the board can do that. The board can also then subsequently change its mind. Oh my goodness, after we did that, we discovered a hole in the roof. We need to fix that. So we're going to take that $5,000 and repurpose it. But you need to have policies in place to make sure that you are governing yourselves in those ways.
I'm pastor at the church where Brewer goes to. In my own mind, I keep because you keep using financial examples, whether it's salary or gifts that are made or endowments, this kind of thing, I keep going back and forth in my mind between what we call the church council, the governing body, and our board of trustees. One of whom, the chair of whom, sits on the council, right? And who makes these decisions, or how are these decisions presented? Who's really the governing body? I see where our trustees are a governing body. I think the way that we're set up, the trustees present to the council and the council makes the final decision, so they are the governing body. But just in terms of power and decision making with all these financial matters, the lines get a little blurred to myself in my mind about who's governing and who's managing and all that.
They do, and so you need to pay attention to your bylaws so that they make that clear. In churches that have both a governing council and a board of trustees, usually the way that is set up is that the board of trustees is entrusted with responsibility over financial matters, at least in the first instance, and the council is entrusted with more programmatic matters, at least in the first instance. As with management, you can bifurcate governing responsibilities by subject matter. So just as management may have a director of Christian education, may have a sexton or property manager, you've divided up management responsibilities. Governance can do that as well. We're going to have this body in charge of governance of programmatic matters, this body in charge of governance of financial matters. You can do that. What I'm cautioning against is that just because you've subdivided governance by topic doesn't mean that they are both governance and management of that topic. So I don't think that there's anything inconsistent with what we're talking about by having a council and a separate board of trustees. It may make it important that your bylaws reflect that, and that both bodies understand they are still governing bodies, not management bodies.
My question is about the bylaws. We drew up new bylaws at our church. Then the moderator decided on the church council that he would select a committee, a bylaw committee, to make changes. And he felt that the bylaws that would be changed would be in anticipation of growth for the church. My question is that the committee was formed, but the moderator is making all the changes to the bylaws.
I was going to talk about it later. Let's talk about it now since it's come up. Governing bodies can only act collectively. No individual member of a governing body has authority to act for the entire governing body unless the governing body has authorized them to do so. So that happens. Delegation of authority happens. Your governing council might have a finance committee that you have delegated the first responsibility of crafting the draft budget. Or you might have a Christian ed committee that you've delegated the responsibility for church curriculum to. But it only happens by that subset because the entire governing body has authorized it. So unless your bylaws or you've had some vote by the entire body has said, Ms. or Mr. Moderator, you are authorized to do this, they are not so authorized to do it. The collective has to do it.
That's why we have congregation meetings. I've seen that happen in our church like that too. But somebody got to speak up when you see something inappropriate. You know, because I've seen some people just ignore it. You got to speak.
And let's bring that topic up because it's come up, and I want to stress the importance of the board governing body needs to police itself. It is not pastor's responsibility to police the boundaries of governance. The governing body has to police its members, and so if you see a governing board member straying into management, straying beyond the authority that they have, the governing board needs to take action.
Excuse me, one of the difficulties that we have back here is can't hear some voices, so we don't know what questions often have.
I'll try and repeat the questions.
Well, that would be a great help. Thank
Okay.
you. I just wanted to be clear that the governing body is strictly a policy-making body.
Correct.
Strictly.
Correct.
May not act, other than as a collective body on any issue.
Unless they have delegated that responsibility to an individual or some subset. I mean, sometimes bylaws will do that delegation.
The management is strictly execution of the policies.
Execution of the program pursuant to the policies that have been adopted.
Then you touched upon the governing law where it may repurpose a donation.
Yes.
And I didn't get past that. I don't know if you concluded that. What gives that body just cause to repurpose a donation that has probably that condition set?
What gives the governing body the ability, authority to repurpose a donation is that they place the restriction on it in the first instance. I'm assuming that the gift was given without restriction, and then the governing body decided we're going to dedicate these unrestricted funds to this dedicated purpose. And then they subsequently decide we've changed our mind, we're now going to dedicate it to a different restricted purpose. Because they're the ones that place the restriction. Just for example, if Congregant Don says, here's $5,000 for a church bus, and you say, you know what, Don, we don't really need a church bus. We need $5,000 to fix the hole in the roof. You go to Don and get him to change the restrictions he placed on those funds. Next in my top 10 is to ensure adequate resources. One of the governing board's foremost responsibilities is to ensure that adequate resources for the ministry to fulfill its mission. It's very easy for us as governing board members to spend the money. We're real good at that, adopting budgets as to how the money that comes in gets spent. It's governing board's responsibility to help get the money to be spent, to ensure that there are adequate resources. And this goes back to you all being the personification of the governing board, being ambassadors for the ministry, and carrying the importance, the need to the congregation in order to raise those dollars. Of course, it's a lot easier to raise those dollars if you're able to articulate the missional priorities that those dollars are going to support, which is why you need that timely mission statement. But the board needs to be about the stewardship campaign. The board has a responsibility to ensure the raising of dollars, not just the spending of them. The next on my top 10 list is ensuring that legal and ethical integrity is observed and to maintain accountability. The governing body is ultimately responsible for ensuring adherence to legal standards and ethical norms. And again, this is done through the adoption of policy and process. So when we talk about legal and ethical integrity, one of the things that's going to arise on the governing body is the notion of conflict of interest. There may be matters that come before the governing body in which a governing body member has a conflict of interest. So for example, the church decides it wants to buy a new church bus. And Don just happens to be in the business of selling buses. And Don wants that business. Don has a conflict of interest. How are you going to deal with that when Don sits on the governing board that's going to decide, are we going to buy a bus? Well, the way that we do this is we have a conflict of interest policy. So we're not dealing with this matter ad hoc when it comes up, but we're going to say, if presented with such a situation, here's how we deal with it. Now, how we usually deal with it is through recusal. Don doesn't participate in the vote. Don doesn't even participate in the discussion about whether or not we're going to purchase a new church bus. But in all too many church settings, if they do have a conflict of interest policy, what I see is they're totally dependent upon voluntary recusal. We expect Don to see the light, understand he has a conflict of interest, and to step aside. You need to account for the possibility that Don won't do that. What if Don says, I was elected by this congregation, I was put on this church council, I have a vote, I have a voice, and I intend to use them? Well, if your conflict of interest policy doesn't address that, you've got a problem. So your conflict of interest policy needs to anticipate that possibility, as rare as it may be, and have some provision for involuntary recusal. Now that should be a rare circumstance, and it should not be taken lightly, because Don was elected by the congregation. So by putting Don off the council, even for this one vote, you're in effect disenfranchising that congregation. So usually that require people that adopt a policy in this area will say it needs a supermajority vote. 2/3 of the council has to vote in favor of involuntarily recusing a board member. As long as it's adopted by the entire governing body, you're good to go with that. But if you don't have policy around this, then you're going to deal with these problems as they arise on an ad hoc basis, and I think you're going to find yourself in more difficulty. The next on my top 10 list is to ensure effective organizational planning. Governing boards have to actively participate in the overall planning process and assist in implementing the plan's goals. We're all familiar with the notion of strategic planning and that being a function of a governing board. What I want to emphasize here is don't forget the implementation piece. Governance is not just about giving orders to others. It's not saying, Pastor, we want giving up 10% next year, go do it. That's not good governance. Good governance takes into effect what's necessary to implement that goal, that policy, and providing for it. It may be providing sufficient dollars for it in the budget. It may be providing sufficient time for it in your expectations of what pastor's going to do. If pastor's expected to raise giving by 10%, the pastor's going to have to devote some time to that, and that's time that can't be devoted to other things. So don't forget your responsibility to provide for adequate implementation of the strategic plans that you adopt.
Just one thing that occurs to me, even if you allow the time, and you've got some money behind that, if your pastor doesn't have the talent, you've got a conflict going on, and something's going to give there, and it probably won't be a good outcome.
And this again is the hand-in-glove relationship that needs to exist between governance and management.
I'm sorry, this probably gets back to ensuring legal and ethical integrity, but recently we had a conversation or two on our council. I've got a strong feeling, may or may not be relevant, but a husband and wife both sitting on the council, the governance board, representing, let's say, one is a trustee, one is a Christian ed chair. I don't feel that there is a conflict of interest, voting power. Can you speak to that at all?
The question is, what about husband and wife both being on the governing body at the same time? I'd extend it to other family members, parent and child. You think of the nature of relationships. I would discourage it. I might even consider prohibiting it in the bylaws. It certainly should be considered by whatever committee is responsible for nominating people to be on the slate that the church congregation votes on for the governing board. But I think it can be problematic. And I think it only increases the possibility of conflict of interest. It certainly results in consolidation of power in a family, if not a couple.
You know, to that question, a lot of the white churches, which are small member churches, and it's all family churches.
Yep.
Practically, majority of the board is all made up of family members. So how do you get around something like that? If you do what you're saying, you ain't gonna have nobody.
The way I've seen some churches do it is they have a governing council that sets policy, but then they have a number of, choose the label you want to put on them, committees, task forces, whatever you want to call them. But they're groups of people that feel passionately about that particular subject matter, are willing to devote their time and attention to carrying out the programmatic initiatives in that particular area. And so there's nothing wrong with my spouse being on a task force, my spouse being on a committee that's combined to the segmented implementation piece. But when you get a consolidation on the governing body that's responsible for everything, policy over all areas, I'm just lifting up that you run the risk. I understand a lot of our churches do it. A lot of our churches have to do it because of their small size. Again, I'm not making pronouncements of never ever. I'm talking about aspirational here, things to strive for, places to try and get to. The next on my top 10 is to recruit and orient new governing board members and assess governing board performance. All governing bodies have a responsibility to help articulate the prerequisites for candidates, to orient new governing board members, and to periodically and comprehensively evaluate the governing board's performance. A couple of statements here. Orientation of new governing board members. If orientation of a new governing church council member is, congratulations, Don, glad the congregation elected you. Our next meeting is Tuesday, see you there. That is not an orientation program. That is orientation by learn by doing. And what happens when orientation of new governing council members is learned by doing, that new member spends the first year of their tenure learning what they're supposed to do. There is too much work to be done and too little time to do it for you to have somebody not be at peak efficiency from day one, for them to take a year to get up to speed. Well, the only way you're going to prevent that is to have an orientation program for new governing board members. There's lots of ways to do it. There's no one way. Some of the ways that some churches do it is, first of all, they'll have such things as a job description for a governing board member. We have job descriptions for our staff. What about a job description, a written job description for a governing board member that outlines what their duties and responsibilities are? Putting together a 3-ring binder of fundamental documents for new governing board members to have. It'll include the bylaws of the church. It'll include copies of the minutes of the last year's worth of council meetings. It'll include budget for the last 2 years. It'll include the policies that have been adopted. All those fundamental documents that a person can read to get up to speed as to what governance in this church is about. What about pairing them in kind of a shepherd program? You put a first-year governing council member, pair them up with somebody who's in their second or third year of their term, and that person is basically their mentor, their person that brings them along as to what it means to be on the governing council. Or just having a weekend orientation program where you go through all this material in intensive with all the new governing council members. There are lots of ways to do this, but if you don't devote some time and attention to orientation, it's going to be on the job, and you're going to lose that person's effectiveness until they get up to speed. The next thing I wanted to lift up was governing board assessing its performance. We're all real good about assessing pastors' performance. We all enjoy doing that. And staff's performance. When's the last time your church council assessed its performance? When is the last time church council said, how good a job are we doing? This doesn't have to be complicated. Frankly, I think you would find it very enlightening if your church council at one of its meetings had everybody take a piece of paper and write down, here are 3 things I think the council is doing well. Here are 3 things I think the church council could do better. And if you shared the results, I think your church council would be amazed at what fellow council members think the council could be doing better. Because council members are all thinking these thoughts. There probably isn't a single council member that doesn't attend a meeting where at one point in time they don't say to themselves, oh, we could be doing this better. But we don't share those thoughts with each other. There's not communication about it. So if we regularize the process and we do it on a periodic basis, let's talk with each other about ways we could be a better church council. Then you can choose 1, 2, or 3 of them and start doing them and become a better council.
You said we don't, as councils, share this. I think it always is shared somewhere, but not as a whole council. And there again, provides an opportunity for conflict to creep into a board and disrupt its effectiveness.
Since it's brought up, let's talk about it right now. One of the attributes of a high-performing governing body is effective conflict management. You are not going to prevent conflict from happening. There is going to be conflict. So the absence of conflict is not the measure of a high-performing governing body. It's how you deal with the conflict when it arises. And I would suggest that there are 2 things you should keep in mind in terms of effective conflict management. 1, be hard on the issues and soft on the people. Don't personalize the conflict. Whether or not we ought to buy a church bus is not a dumb idea because it's Don's idea. It may be a dumb idea because it doesn't align with the missional priorities of our ministry at this time. But don't personalize it, stay on the merits of the issue. Second, no triangulation. If you've got a problem with Don, you take that problem to Don. You don't take it to a fellow council member. You don't take it to pastor in the first instance. You deal with the conflict where the conflict originates from. You may need to involve others later, but no triangulation. The next on my list of top 10 is to enhance the ministry's public standing. The governing board should clearly articulate the ministry's mission accomplishments and goals to the public, the constituents, and garner the support from the community. This again is, you are the ambassadors. You are the personification of this ministry. People expect this of you as members of the governing council. It therefore means you need to be out there as ambassador, talking about the missional priorities so that people understand. Increasingly, we've got members of our congregation writing checks for Bread for the World, Habitat for Humanity, Heifer Project, and yet we bemoan how our church's wider mission is declining, and giving to the church is declining. Well, let's be honest with ourselves. If you were to take 6 members of your congregation at random and ask them, what does Habitat for Humanity do? And then you were to ask those same 6 people, what is our church's wider ministry and what does it do? Let's be honest with ourselves. A good number of those 6 people are going to be able to give you a pretty close statement as to what Habitat for Humanity does. And all too few of those 6 people are going to be able to tell you what our church's wider mission is or what it does. That's our fault. That's the communicator's fault. It's not the listener's fault. I'm a trial lawyer. When I lose a case, it's not the judge's fault. It's not the jury's fault. It's my fault. I have not effectively communicated my position so that they understand and are persuaded. As ministry leaders, you are the communicators. You have the responsibility of articulating what are the missional priorities. Why are they important? Why do these dollars support that? Why is it important that they consider giving their dollars to this ministry? It's part of your role and responsibility as ministry leaders. The 9th on my top 10 list is to determine, monitor, and strengthen the ministry's programs and services. The governing body's responsibility is to determine which programs are consistent with the ministry's mission and to monitor their effectiveness. One example I want to talk about here is what I call withering pet projects. Too many churches that I know of, somewhere in their budget, have a line item for a program that really doesn't any longer align with the missional priorities of that church. But because they don't have the stomach for confronting the person that originated that program, we just carry it along in our budget year after year after year. It's the governing board's responsibility to make the decision as to whether or not a project supports the missional priorities of this ministry, and if it doesn't, it needs to be brought to an end. I don't know of any church that has enough money to be carrying projects financially that don't support the missional priorities of that church. I don't know any church that wealthy. And you all are the stewards of the church's resources. So it's your responsibility to make sure that you are good stewards and that dollars are flowing to programs that support missional responsibility. It's not to say that these projects did not do great things. They were a great idea at the time they first came forward and adopted. They were consistent with the missional priorities of the church at that time. The question is, are they consistent with the missional priorities of the church at this time? So celebrate those programs. Honor them for the good work that they did, but bring them to an end, at least as part of the church's budget. That's part of governance. The last of my top 10 is to support the chief executive. In most instances, we're talking about the senior pastor, and assess her or his performance. The governing board has to ensure that the chief executive has the moral and professional support that she or he needs to further the missional goals of the ministry. Notice that I said support your management leader. And in order to support your management leader, there can be no ambushing of your pastor. There shouldn't be anything appearing on the agenda of the church council that pastor doesn't know about in advance. This needs to be a hand-in-glove relationship in order for governance to be the best it can be and for management to be the best it can be. It's governance responsibility to be attentive to that. Now, I've talked about the top 10 responsibilities that a church council has got collectively. I want to talk about the legal duties that each individual member of that governing body have. The law talks about these legal responsibilities in terms of being duties. So I want to talk about the legal duties that every governing body member has. The first is what the law calls the duty of care and diligence. The duty of care for a governing board member is the responsibility to actively participate in making decisions on behalf of the ministry and to exercise their best judgment in doing so. In order to fulfill your duty of care as a governing board member, you need to attend the meetings. You can't be fulfilling your duty of care if you don't attend the meetings. The board needs to police itself in this regard. There should be some process in place to take action on someone that misses the meetings. There's too much work to be done, too little time and too few people for someone not to be fulfilling their responsibility in this regard. Different church councils do this in different ways. Some do it at least by having a record in the minutes of who attended and who was absent. Others go a step further and make that absence known to the person who wasn't there. The chair of the council or someone else calls up Don. Don, we missed you at last night's council meeting. We wish you were there. We look forward to you being at the next meeting, which is 3 weeks from today. And at some point, you may need a bylaw provision that allows you to remove a council member that just doesn't show up. So if somebody misses 3 meetings in a row, they've automatically resigned from the council by their actions. Some bylaws along those lines. You can't afford to be down a person on the council. But physical presence is not enough to meet your duty of care. Just being at the meeting is not enough. You have to have prepared for that meeting. That means reading the material in advance, reading the council packet or whatever's been distributed or made available in advance of the meeting so that you can hit the ground running with the business that's going to be taken up at that meeting. If you have a council member, when you're taking up the first draft of the budget, says, can we take a 15-minute break? I haven't had a chance to read this stuff. No, we can't. There's too much work to do and too little time to do it in. The board needs to police this. And someone needs to take council member Don aside and say, no, Don, we can't take a time out. You need to read this stuff before you get here. The next of the legal duties that's imposed on each individual is what the law calls the duty of loyalty and good faith. Governing board members have to act with honesty and fair dealing, and when acting on behalf of the ministry in a decision-making capacity, governing board members have to set aside their own personal interests, that ministry's needs come first. Now, the example I want to give of fulfilling this duty is the issue of advocacy for a particular point of view or program. So let's say that your church council is deciding what is going to be our missional priority this year. And someone says, you know what? It ought to be youth programming. The future is all about the young people. If this church is not about the young people, we're going to be a dying church. We need to be devoting our time and our money to youth programming. And another council member says, you know, it's all about music ministry. That's what the people in our congregation respond to. Attendance is never higher than when we've got a special musical program presentation in the church. We ought to be devoting time and attention to the music ministry of this church to grow this church. Now the council's going to debate that, and individuals are going to argue their perspective on that. You're not expected, in fulfilling your duty of loyalty, to give up your point of view. You may think youth programming is the way to go. Somebody else may think music ministry is the way to go. But what the duty of loyalty requires at the end of the day, when the yeas and nays are called, because the church doesn't have enough time and money to do both, it has to decide which it's going to do. You support the outcome of that vote, even if it's not the one you were advocating for. Because you have too much respect for the process that led to that decision to not support it. You were given time and an opportunity to make your views known, to communicate, to persuade your fellow council members. But at the end of the day, a majority decided to go in a different direction, and you have too much respect for the process. You're going to be loyal to the decision that was made by the group. You are not going to go amongst your fellow congregants next Sunday saying, the council doesn't know what they were doing. I told them it was all about music. They wouldn't listen to me.
What do you do about those? Didn't go my way, I'm going to quit the church.
There's the door. If you can't be loyal, if you can't have enough respect for the church council process, then get off the council. The last legal duty that the law imposes on you is what it calls the duty of obedience. Governing board members need to know and follow their ministry's governing documents and not exceed their authority. The duty of obedience is simply doing that which you're allowed to do under your governing documents. So you need to be familiar with your bylaws. You need to follow your bylaws. Something that's starting to hit my desk with too much frequency is churches saying, oh, we voted to suspend our bylaws. You can't suspend bylaws. You can amend bylaws, but you can't suspend them. You have to go through whatever amendment process the bylaws provide. So you have to do that work. Yes, sir.
Question. Hypothetically, you have in your bylaws that if someone wants notice, they need 45 days notice to make a comment. Can you extend that if you feel you've got a notice out to the congregation too late? Like, okay, we'll suspend the 45-day notice, you now have 60 days notice to respond. Something like that. Or am I too unclear?
The question as I hear it is, if a bylaw sets a notice requirement of X number of days, can you make it a longer period of time? I want to look at the bylaws to be definitive, but not having seen the bylaws, you likely can make a longer period of time available. You cannot make a shorter period of time. So you cannot say, well, we know we're supposed to give 45 days notice of the agenda for the annual church meeting, but something's come up, and therefore we want to add it even though the church meeting is in 30 days. You can't do that if your bylaws provide a notice period. What you can do is then hold a special church meeting to deal with that new issue. All the way in the back.
We have, this is going back to your plenary session comments as well as something else just made. We have an organization within our church that's an auxiliary organization of the church, a recognized auxiliary organization. It actually has a fair amount of money because it runs our runner sales, and runner sale proceeds go to it. And it often goes to give the church money from that for special projects, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know how good minutes that body is keeping. So in the event of a disagreement or an accusation of conflict of interest or whatever, should the governing board of the church require that auxiliary organization to keep minutes, and should we keep the minutes? Should we have minutes?
Question is the nature of the relationship, and especially governance relationship between the church and its governing body and an auxiliary body. In this particular instance, we're talking about an auxiliary organization that does a church rummage sale, raises money from it, makes decisions on the proceeds going to the church from those activities. Unless that group is separately incorporated or separately constituted, it is part of the church. It is not separate and distinct and can't govern itself other than as provided for in your church bylaws.
Because it is under a nonprofit status, but we report the money on, the tax forms. We do have accounting for them.
All right, if they're separately incorporated and have their own 501c3,
They're under ours. They're under the church's bylaws.
all right,
So they have.
then they are a part of the church. The only extent that they have independence from the church is whatever is provided in your church bylaws. And therefore, the governing body of the church needs to be exercising oversight over that entity unless the bylaws provide otherwise. I've only got 5 minutes. I want to get through attributes of a high-performing governing body. How would you know that you're doing it well? One of the ways is that it would be clear that the role of the governing board is clear and distinct from the role of the staff. We've talked about the difference between governance and management. I want to emphasize this point by saying that what the governing board wants to do, the church council wants to do, is avoid the two extremes. On the one hand, there's the extreme of rubber stamping. Whatever you say goes, Pastor. That's a great idea. Whatever you want to do, somebody pass the donuts, please. That's rubber stamping management. That's not good governance. The other extreme, on the other end, is micromanaging. Church needs to buy a new copier. Pastor goes out, gets bids, buys a Minolta. Pastor, what were you thinking? Everyone in his right mind knows that Xerox is a better copier. That's micromanaging. That's not good governance. So you want to avoid those two extremes. You want to be somewhere in the middle. understanding the difference between policy, governance, and management. Second, the role of individual board members is clear and boundaries are maintained. We talked about this a little. Board acts collectively. No individual board member speaks or acts for the governing body unless authorized by that governing body to do so. You need to hold your fellow governing body members accountable in this regard. And the last we talked about, which was effective conflict management. And the final one we talked about really as the first one, taking periodic time out to improve skill sets of the governing council members, doing things like you're doing today, educating yourselves about good governance. There may be other topics you need to periodically engage in, improve your skill sets to be good governing members. Now, the takeaway from today should not be, oh my goodness, when I listen to what he said and I look at what we're doing, there are 25 things we're not doing what he said. That's too many, I'm overwhelmed, we'll just keep doing what we're doing. Okay? No one is doing all of this. No one. Not even the boards I'm the chair of are doing all of this. Good governance is a process, it's an evolution. We get better. We never are the best. So the takeaway from today is, well, I've heard of some things we might do better. And maybe I think we're going to start by asking our church council to everybody write down 3 things they think the council could do better. And then we're going to decide which 1 or 2 of those we're going to do this year. Maybe it's develop a timely mission statement. Maybe it's something else. But you do 1 or 2 things better each year and you get better and better and better. That's what the takeaway from today should be. Those that want to go to lunch are free. Thank you for being with me. If anyone's got questions, you can see me.